The cold hum of machinery filled the air, a monotonous rhythm that seemed to mock the cries echoing through the desolate corridors of the ship. In a dimly lit cell, a young alien girl sat huddled in the corner, her translucent skin glowing faintly with the colors of anguish. Her voice, though hoarse from hours of screaming, carried a haunting resonance that seeped into the walls, a mixture of grief and terror so profound it unsettled even the heartless beings who caged her. The girl, barely old enough by her species' standards to understand what had happened, was a Varani. Her kind were renowned across the galaxies not for their strength or intellect but for their unique emotional frequencies, an ability to project feelings into others with devastating clarity. This gift, once a cherished part of her peaceful world, had become her curse. The Drakther, a race of conquerors known for their cruelty, saw her as a rare and valuable commodity. To them, she was not a person but a tool, a living weapon to be sold to the highest bidder. Her cell was a bleak, sterile cube of steel, barely large enough to stretch her limbs. The only light came from the faint glow of her skin, which shifted erratically between shades of red and gray, a visual symphony of her despair. She clutched her knees to her chest, rocking slightly as she let out another cry. It was less a call for help and more a release of the unbearable weight pressing down on her. Help, she knew, was a distant fantasy. No one in this place cared. Or so she thought. In a far corner of the ship, Jack Turner paused in his work. The cry pierced the steady drone of engines and alarms, an alien yet strangely human sound that wormed its way past his defenses. He adjusted his grip on a spanner, narrowing his eyes as he tilted his head toward the sound. He had heard it before, faintly, but today it was sharper, more desperate. He muttered a curse under his breath and glanced around to ensure no one was watching before stepping away from his post. Jack wasn't supposed to be here. Posing as a mechanic on a Drakther slave ship was dangerous enough, but straying from his assigned duties bordered on suicidal. Yet, as he followed the sound, his steps grew steadier. The further he went, the more the cries twisted something deep inside him, a raw nerve he hadn't felt in years. The screams reminded him of another time, another place, where he had failed to act. He wouldn't fail again. Reaching the cell block, Jack kept to the shadows, his boots making barely a sound on the cold metal floor. The stench of fear and despair hung thick in the air, a suffocating reminder of the lives trapped here. His eyes scanned the cells, most filled with silent, defeated figures. Then he saw her. She was smaller than he had imagined, barely more than a child, her frail frame trembling with every sob. Her skin glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the cell. But it was her eyes that held him in place. Wide and luminescent, they were filled with a mixture of terror and defiance, a silent plea for someone, anyone, to notice her. Jack crouched low, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't approach immediately, didn't speak. Instead, he watched, taking in every detail. The dampening field surrounding her cell hummed faintly, a barrier designed to suppress her abilities. It was advanced technology, likely impossible to disable without alerting the entire ship. But what struck Jack most was the way she seemed to flinch at every sound, every flicker of movement outside her cage. She was more than scared, she was broken. After a few moments, he took a small step closer, his hand brushing the cold steel of the cell's frame. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. For a split second, there was only silence. Then she recoiled, pressing herself against the far wall. Jack raised his hands slowly, palms outward, a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship. She didn't move, her gaze darting between his hands and his face. Jack could see the distrust etched into every line of her expression. He couldn't blame her. In her position, he'd feel the same. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed packet of water. Holding it up, he placed it gently on the ground, just inside the field. "For you," he said, stepping back immediately. She stared at the packet, her body rigid, before inching forward. Tentatively, she extended a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the edge of the field. The barrier sparked slightly, but the packet was close enough for her to snatch it without harm. As she drank, Jack watched the colors of her skin shift subtly, the reds fading to softer hues of orange and yellow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him he had done something right. "I'll be back," he said, rising to his feet. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. She let out a small, choked sound, reaching toward him as if to stop him. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the edge of the cell. "I promise," he said softly. "I'll come back." She didn't respond, but as he turned to leave, he felt her gaze on him, a heavy, desperate weight that followed him long after he disappeared into the shadows. Jack's hands worked methodically as he repaired a malfunctioning panel near the slave ship's ventilation systems. His thoughts, however, were elsewhere. He replayed the image of the alien girl in her cage, the haunting resonance of her cries still echoing in his mind. Her trust was fragile, her fear palpable. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure if he could live with himself if he let that hope die. He used his downtime to map out the ship's layout, piecing together every detail he had learned during his time aboard. The Drachther ship was a fortress, its corridors patrolled by armed guards and its systems monitored by a near-sentient AI. Escaping was not just difficult, it was suicidal. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't leave her behind. Jack spent days observing the routines of the guards. They were predictable, almost mechanical in their patrols. He noted every blind spot, every moment of distraction. The dampening field around the alien girl's cell was a significant obstacle, but he had identified a weak point in its power source, a maintenance conduit that fed directly into the field's generator. If he could disable it, even briefly, she might be able to use her abilities to help them escape. During his next visit, he brought a small device he had cobbled together from spare parts. It was rudimentary but functional, designed to emit a short-range EMP pulse that could disrupt the dampening field for a few seconds. He slipped it into the pocket of his coveralls, knowing it was the key to their survival. He approached the alien girl's cell cautiously. She was curled up in the corner, her translucent skin dim and colorless. When she saw him, her eyes widened, and her skin flickered faintly with a pale green hue. He knelt down and slid another packet of water through the barrier. This time, she took it without hesitation. "I need you to trust me," he whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. Her gaze was steady, but her body was tense, as if bracing for something terrible. He explained his plan in simple terms, using gestures to illustrate what he couldn't put into words. Her expression shifted as she began to understand. When he finished, she nodded slowly. Jack spent the next few days preparing. He hacked into the ship's network, a dangerous task that required him to bypass layers of security. He created a diversion by scheduling a false maintenance alert in a distant part of the ship. The alert would draw most of the guards away from the cell block, giving them a narrow window to act. He also modified a maintenance droid, programming it to create additional chaos during their escape. The droid was equipped with a small explosive charge, enough to disable a security terminal without causing significant damage. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. On the night of the escape, Jack made his way to the cell block under the guise of performing routine maintenance. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the alien girl's cell. The corridors were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense stillness. He slipped the EMP device from his pocket and held it tightly. He activated the device, and the dampening field around the cell flickered and died. The alien girl's skin flared brightly, shifting to vibrant shades of green and blue. Jack motioned for her to follow him, and she stepped out of the cell hesitantly, her movements uncertain but determined. They moved quickly through the ship's corridors, avoiding the remaining guards. The alien girl's abilities proved invaluable. She could sense the emotions of the guards, allowing them to anticipate their movements and avoid detection. At one point, they encountered a patrol, and Jack froze, his hand hovering over his weapon. But the alien girl reached out, her skin glowing softly, and the guards stopped abruptly, their faces contorted with confusion. They turned and walked away, as if compelled by an unseen force. As they approached the docking bay, The ship's alarms blared to life. Their absence had been discovered. Jack cursed under his breath and quickened his pace, pulling the alien girl along. The modified droid had already done its job, creating a smokescreen that obscured their path. They reached the docking bay just as a group of Dracthyr soldiers emerged from the smoke. Jack drew his weapon, his jaw set in determination. The alien girl stepped forward, her skin glowing with an intensity that illuminated the bay. The soldiers hesitated, their movements sluggish. She raised her hands, and a wave of emotion washed over them, fear, despair, and an overwhelming sense of futility. The soldiers dropped their weapons, their expressions vacant. Jack didn't waste time. He guided the alien girl onto a small, unguarded shuttle. The vessel was old but functional, its controls familiar to him from his time as a pilot. He started the engines, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. As the shuttle lifted off, the Dracthyr ship's defenses activated, sending a volley of laser fire in their direction. The shuttle shuddered under the impact, but Jack managed to evade the worst of it. The alien girl sat beside him, her hands gripping the edges of her seat tightly. Her skin glowed faintly, a mix of fear and hope. Jack glanced at her and offered a reassuring nod. The shuttle burst through the ship's defenses and into the void of space. Jack set a course for a nearby asteroid field, using the debris as cover to evade pursuit. When they were finally clear, he leaned back in his seat, his chest heaving with relief. The alien girl turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with gratitude. For the first time, her skin shifted to a soft, steady green, a color Jack had come to associate with calm and hope. He smiled faintly and nodded. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low but steady. She didn't respond with words, but her expression said everything. For the first time in days, she was free. The alarms blared across the ship, their sharp wail reverberating through the corridors. The Dracthyr soldiers scrambled into action, barking orders and preparing for a confrontation. Jack gripped the controls of the stolen shuttle tightly, his knuckles whitening as he navigated the vessel through the asteroid field. The ship's thrusters roared, propelling them forward with barely enough speed to stay ahead of the incoming pursuit. The alien girl sat beside him, her glowing skin dimming and brightening in erratic pulses, reflecting her fear and uncertainty. The shuttle shook violently as a near miss sent debris ricocheting off its hull. Jack cursed under his breath, his focus unyielding. "Hold on," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she understood his words. He pulled the shuttle into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding another volley of laser fire. The alien girl's hands clung to the edge of her seat, her luminous gaze fixed on him. He could feel the weight of her trust, and it spurred him forward. A Dracthyr fighter appeared on their tail, its sleek frame cutting through the debris with precision. Jack adjusted the shuttle's trajectory, weaving through the asteroid field with calculated risk. The fighter fired again, its shots grazing the shuttle's wing. Sparks erupted, and warning lights flashed across the console. Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. The shuttle was not built for combat. Their only chance was to outmaneuver their pursuers. "Can you do something?" he asked, glancing at the alien girl. She hesitated, her glowing skin flickering uncertainly. She raised her hands, her expression one of intense concentration. A faint hum filled the air, and Jack felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if an invisible force was pressing down on him. The pursuing fighter wavered, its movements becoming erratic. The pilot, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion projected by the alien girl, veered off course and collided with a nearby asteroid in a fiery explosion. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's one way to handle it," he said, sparing her a quick, approving glance. She looked at him, her skin glowing faintly with a soft green hue, a silent acknowledgement of his gratitude. He returned his focus to the controls, knowing their escape was far from over. The asteroid field thinned as they approached open space. Jack adjusted their heading, aiming for a nearby jump point that would take them out of the Dracthyr's territory. The ship's systems, however, were barely holding together. The engine sputtered, and a warning klaxon signaled a critical failure in the rear thrusters. Jack slammed his fist against the console, willing the shuttle to stay operational for just a little longer. Another Dracthyr ship appeared in the distance, its massive silhouette dwarfing their fragile vessel. Jack's heart sank as he recognized it, a cruiser armed with enough firepower to obliterate them in seconds. The alien girl's glowing skin shifted to a deep red, mirroring the dread that coursed through them both. Jack tightened his grip on the controls, his mind racing for a way out. As the cruiser closed in, Jack activated the shuttle's remaining power reserves, diverting everything to the engines. The shuttle surged forward, but it wasn't fast enough. The cruiser's weapon systems locked onto them, and Jack could see the faint glow of charging plasma cannons. Time seemed to slow as he prepared for the inevitable. Suddenly, the alien girl reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her touch was cool, but it carried an unexpected calm. Her skin shifted to a steady blue, and Jack felt an odd sense of peace wash over him. She closed her eyes, and the faint hum returned, growing louder with each passing second. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, and Jack glanced at her, unsure of what was happening. The cruiser fired, but before the plasma bolts could reach them, they were enveloped in a shimmering wave of light. The bolts dissipated harmlessly, their energy absorbed by the strange field the alien girl had created. Jack stared in disbelief as the cruiser's systems flickered, its weapons falling silent. The girl's abilities had somehow extended beyond the shuttle, disrupting the larger ship's systems and rendering it powerless. Jack didn't wait to question it. He pushed the shuttle to its limits, guiding it toward the jump point as fast as the damaged engines would allow. The alien girl slumped back in her seat, her glowing skin dimming to a faint yellow. She looked exhausted, but her eyes held a quiet determination. Jack felt a surge of admiration for her resilience. They reached the jump point just as the cruiser regained power. Jack activated the hyperdrive, the shuttle shaking violently as it prepared for the jump. The cruiser's weapons fired again, but this time, the bolts passed harmlessly behind them. The stars stretched into streaks of light as the shuttle leapt into hyperspace, leaving their pursuers far behind. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jack leaned back in his seat, his chest heaving with relief. He glanced at the alien girl, who was watching him with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Her skin glowed faintly with a soft green hue, the color of calm and hope. Jack smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like hours. The shuttle system stabilized as they exited hyperspace, the stars returning to their familiar pinpricks of light. Jack set a course for a nearby neutral sector, one known for its lack of Dracthyr influence. The journey would take several hours, giving them time to regroup and assess their situation. Jack turned to the alien girl, his expression serious but kind. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're safe for now," he said. She nodded, her glowing skin shifting to a soft yellow. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed more than words ever could. As the shuttle cruised through the vast expanse of space, Jack allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had risked everything to save her, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he couldn't help but feel he had made the right choice. The alien girl sat quietly beside him, her presence a reminder of why he had taken this risk in the first place. For now they were free. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a glimmer of hope.